John Henry Doc Holliday, known to history as one of the most feared and infamous gunfighters of the American Wild West, began life in a way that few would imagine could lead to the violent and chaotic life for which he would later become legendary. Born on August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia, he entered a family that had already experienced sorrow and loss, and whose social position promised comfort and opportunity, yet was shadowed by fragility and uncertainty. Griffin, at the time, was a thriving cotton town, polished and prosperous on the surface, but underneath, life was often harsh and unforgiving. It was in this environment that young John, later known as Doc Holliday, began to form the patterns of thought and resilience that would follow him throughout his life. The family into which he was born, the Hollidays, were relatively well off. His father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, and mother, Alice Jane McKee Holliday, enjoyed a good home, social respect, and financial stability, which offered young John an upbringing marked by education and refinement. His mother, in particular, was a gentle yet strong woman, a figure of intelligence and discipline, who taught him not only French and Latin but also piano, providing him with a cultured upbringing uncommon in much of the rural South at that time. However, this period of comfort and refinement was deeply colored by personal tragedy. Less than 2 years before John's birth, the family had lost a child, Martha Eleanor Holliday, who lived for only 6 months. Such early deaths were tragically common in that era, but for the Holliday family, the loss left a permanent shadow over the household. Alice, still grieving her first child, poured her maternal attention into John when he arrived, nurturing him with a care that would shape his early years. This early loss of a sibling instilled in John an awareness of mortality and the fragility of life, lessons that would remain with him in all his later endeavors. The environment of the American South during John's childhood was itself a mixture of tradition, education, and looming instability. Families like the Hollidays often faced not just the common hardships of life, but also the extraordinary stresses of a society on the brink of enormous change. The shadow of the Civil War was already growing, and the fragility of life, frequently demonstrated by disease and early death, underscored every moment of childhood in the South. By the time he reached adolescence, John had experienced the fragility of human life firsthand, a lesson that would be reinforced when tuberculosis, the disease that would ultimately define and destroy his adult life, was already quietly present in his household. These early years combined the safety of privilege with the lessons of loss, creating a young man who was both well-educated and intimately familiar with the realities of pain and grief. The duality of this upbringing, refined yet shadowed, cultured yet fragile, shaped the young Holliday into a person who could appreciate the finer things in life but also endure suffering and challenge with a resolve that would become legendary in the rough environment of the West. As John Henry Holliday moved into his teenage years, the life of relative comfort he had enjoyed began to unravel under the weight of personal tragedy and social upheaval. By 1866, when John was only 15, the disease that would eventually claim his life had already entered his world in a deeply personal way. His mother, Alice Jane Holliday, who had nurtured and educated him with such dedication, fell gravely ill with tuberculosis. In a time before modern medicine, tuberculosis was a relentless and merciless disease. There were no antibiotics, no reliable treatments, and it spread silently, sometimes for years, slowly weakening the body. Young John, who had been intensely bonded with his mother, found himself caring for her during her illness. He stayed by her side as she coughed blood, wiped her face, and watched the slow erosion of her health, an experience that left an indelible mark on him both physically and emotionally. Many historians believe that it was during this period of close contact that John himself contracted tuberculosis, a disease that would follow him for the rest of his life and ultimately define much of his adult experience. The loss of his mother was more than a personal tragedy, it was a turning point. Alice had been the stabilizing force in his life, the one who offered love, guidance, and education amid the chaos of the post-Civil War South. Her death on September 16, 1866, shattered him completely. Witnesses later described the young Holliday as a boy transformed, no longer the carefree child of a privileged household, but a young man hardened by grief and aware of the fragility of life. The trauma of this loss was compounded by the broader context of the time. Georgia, like much of the South, was still reeling from the Civil War, which had ended just a year earlier. Families were displaced, homes and towns destroyed, and the social fabric of communities had been torn apart. Disease, poverty, and violence were widespread. For a boy like John, these conditions reinforced the lessons he had learned at home. Life was unpredictable, often cruel, and death could come at any moment. His father, Henry Holliday, while still present, was unable to provide the same nurturing and emotional support that Alice had offered. A stern and practical man, Henry had been shaped by his experiences in the war and by previous personal losses. He was not unloving, but his approach to life was shaped by discipline and resilience rather than emotional closeness. For John, the absence of maternal guidance created a vacuum that left him both vulnerable and fiercely independent. In the face of grief and illness, he learned to rely on himself, to endure pain without complaint, and to observe life with the caution and sharpness that would later serve him in the dangerous and violent environment of the American West. This period also marked the beginning of his intellectual and professional development. Despite the trauma, John continued his education, focusing on the skills that his mother had prized: language, music, and academic knowledge. He eventually followed her wish that he pursue dentistry, a profession requiring discipline, intelligence, and precision. Yet, the shadow of grief and illness meant that John would never fully follow the path of a conventional, safe life. Instead, the combination of personal loss, exposure to disease, and the social turmoil of the South created in him a sense of urgency, a recognition that life could be fleeting, and a willingness to take risks that would characterize his later years. In these formative years, the lessons of mortality, suffering, and resilience were etched deeply into his character, shaping not just the man he would become, but the legend that history would remember. Doc Holliday, the cultured, intelligent, and yet deadly figure who walked the line between refinement and violence, always carrying the shadow of his mother's death and his own fragile health. Following the death of his mother, John Henry Holliday faced the challenge of continuing his life in a world that suddenly seemed much harsher and less secure. Despite the grief that weighed heavily upon him, he pursued the education his mother had valued so deeply. Alice Holliday had instilled in him a love of learning, particularly languages, literature, and music, and those lessons became both a refuge and a foundation for the young man. By his mid-teens, John had already demonstrated remarkable intelligence and discipline, qualities that would serve him well in the years ahead. Following Alice's death, he focused even more on academics and professional training, largely guided by the practical influence of his father and the expectations of Southern society. It was during this period that he decided to pursue dentistry, a field that combined precision, intelligence, and social respect. Dentistry, in the mid-19th century, was a profession that required a steady hand, attention to detail, and a commitment to learning, the same qualities that John had cultivated throughout his upbringing. By 1872, at just 21 years old, he graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, one of the most prestigious dental schools of the era. This achievement alone marked him as exceptional. He was well-educated, cultured, and skilled in a profession that promised stability and respect. In addition to his academic accomplishments, John maintained interests that reflected his refined upbringing. He was fluent in French and Latin, played the piano, and appreciated literature and art. These accomplishments set him apart from the rough-and-tumble youth of his southern town, creating a contrast that would follow him for the rest of his life, a man of culture and intellect living in a violent, lawless world. Yet even as he completed his studies, the seeds of restlessness and rebellion were beginning to emerge. John's health had been compromised since childhood, and tuberculosis, which he likely contracted from caring for his mother, was an ever-present threat. Doctors warned him that he might not live long if he remained in humid climates or overexerted himself. This looming awareness of mortality may have contributed to a growing desire for adventure, risk, and a life less constrained by convention. Around the same time, John's personality, already shaped by grief and independence, began to assert itself more boldly. While he was capable of refinement and professionalism, he also developed a taste for danger and confrontation, qualities that would later define his reputation in the American West. His social experiences in Georgia further reinforced this duality. He was admired for his intelligence and manners, yet he occasionally clashed with peers who misunderstood his sharp wit or independent nature. These early experiences taught him that life often required both brains and courage, a combination that would later make him a formidable opponent in the violent frontier towns of the West. By the time he completed his dental training, John Holliday was a man uniquely positioned at the intersection of two worlds: the refined, educated world of cities and cultured society, and the harsh, lawless, and unpredictable world of the American frontier. He had the skills, intellect, and sophistication to succeed in a conventional profession, but the early losses, fragile health, and experiences with danger had also prepared him for a life where physical courage, quick thinking, and a willingness to take risks were necessary for survival. It was this combination, cultured intellect, professional skill, and exposure to mortality, that created the complex, almost paradoxical figure who would become Doc Holliday. He was a man who could compose a piano sonata in the morning and face a gunfighter in the evening, someone whose life would continually balance refinement and violence, culture and chaos. These formative years, spent in study, reflection, and preparation, were crucial in shaping both the man and the legend. They provided the skills, discipline, and foundation, while also allowing room for the darker, more dangerous side of his personality to emerge, one that the West would later know all too well. After completing his education and earning a respected degree in dentistry, John Henry Holliday faced a stark reality. His health was fragile, and the disease that would eventually define his life, tuberculosis, was relentless. Doctors warned him that remaining in the humid climate of Georgia could worsen his condition and shorten his life. With a combination of pragmatism and the adventurous spirit that had been nurtured through hardship, Holliday made a bold decision that would set the stage for his transformation from cultured dentist to legendary figure of the American West. Around the early 1870s, he began traveling westward, seeking both a drier climate to preserve his health and new opportunities that a Southern upbringing and education could not offer. The journey was far from easy. Tuberculosis in the 19th century was poorly understood, and treatment consisted mostly of rest, dry air, and avoidance of overexertion. For a young man like Holliday, driven by ambition, curiosity, and a certain defiance of limitations, the West offered both promise and danger, a combination that would become a defining motif in his life. His first experiences in the frontier towns of Texas and the surrounding territories introduced him to a world vastly different from the orderly life he had known in Griffin. The frontier was harsh, lawless, and unpredictable. Violence was commonplace, and reputations were established quickly through courage, skill, or sheer audacity. Holliday, despite his refined upbringing, adapted rapidly to these conditions. He was intelligent, observant, and physically capable, traits that allowed him to navigate a world where disputes were often resolved with guns rather than words. Around this time, Holliday began to develop the dual identity for which he would become famous: a man of refinement and education, skilled in dentistry and polite conversation, yet capable of extreme violence when provoked. His intelligence and calm demeanor concealed a fiery temper and lethal precision that others soon learned to respect and fear. Early incidents in Texas foreshadowed the path that lay ahead. Holliday became known for his skill with a firearm, often using it to defend himself or assert his reputation in saloons and town disputes. At the same time, he maintained his professional identity as a dentist, providing care to those in frontier communities who otherwise had limited access to medical knowledge. This unusual combination of professions and abilities made him both respected and notorious. Tuberculosis continued to haunt him, shaping his decisions and sense of urgency. He knew that his time might be limited, and this awareness contributed to the boldness with which he pursued life and adventure. Every gunfight, every risky encounter was underscored by the knowledge that his health might fail him at any moment. In many ways, the disease that weakened his body sharpened his mind and honed his instincts, forcing him to rely on skill and strategy rather than brute force alone. By the mid-1870s, Holliday's reputation had begun to spread across Texas and into Arizona territory. Stories circulated of a quiet, cultured man who could charm with conversation and piano music, yet transform into a deadly opponent when provoked. This duality fascinated and terrified those who met him. It also marked the beginning of his path toward legendary status. The move west, initially motivated by health concerns, had become a journey into identity and destiny. In the harsh frontier towns, Holliday's upbringing, intelligence, and professional skills coexisted with the darker lessons of loss, grief, and mortality he had learned as a child. The young man from Georgia was becoming the infamous Doc Holliday, a figure whose name would be remembered for both refinement and lethal precision. Each town, each encounter, and each brush with disease shaped him, preparing him for the high-stakes confrontations that would later define the mythology of the Wild West. He was no longer just a dentist or a son of privilege. He was a survivor, a risk-taker, and a man forging his legend in a land where life was fragile and danger was always close. By the mid-1870s, John Henry Doc Holliday had fully entered the unpredictable and often violent world of the American frontier, and the young dentist from Georgia had begun to forge the dual identity that would make him legendary. While he continued to practice dentistry in towns across Texas and Arizona, it was his encounters with violence, his skill with firearms, and his reputation for fearless confrontation that increasingly defined him in the eyes of his contemporaries. The West offered a place where past status, wealth, or education mattered less than courage, speed, and reputation, and Holliday adapted to this reality quickly. He became a figure who could walk seamlessly between the worlds of civilization and chaos, moving from the refined practice of dentistry to the rough, often deadly confrontations of saloon and street disputes. One of the factors that contributed to his rise as a feared gunfighter was his intelligence and strategic thinking, qualities that had been nurtured in his early life. Holliday understood not only how to handle a firearm with precision but also how to read people, anticipate their actions, and assert control over tense situations. In an era when many conflicts were resolved by violence, this combination of skill and intellect made him formidable. Yet it was not only skill that built his reputation. His personality, calm, polite, and articulate in some situations and sudden, decisive, and deadly in others, created an aura of unpredictability. People never knew whether they would encounter the refined, educated gentleman or the lethal gunfighter, and that uncertainty contributed greatly to the fear he inspired. Holliday's life in the West was also shaped by the relationships he formed with other notable figures. Among the most significant was his friendship and loyalty to Wyatt Earp, the lawman who would later become famous in connection with the gunfight at the Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. Their bond was built on mutual respect, trust, and shared experiences in a harsh and often lawless environment. Holliday, though smaller in stature and weakened by tuberculosis, had a reputation for courage and precision that complemented Earp's authority and skill, and together, they formed a partnership that would leave a lasting mark on Western history. Socially, Holliday was both respected and feared. In frontier towns, he could charm with conversation and music, displaying the manners and education of his upbringing, yet he could quickly become the center of attention in any confrontation, capable of using a pistol with deadly efficiency. This combination of traits allowed him to survive in environments that often claimed the lives of lesser men and contributed to the development of a legend that blended fact and myth. The move to Tombstone, Arizona, marked the beginning of the most famous chapter in his life. By the late 1870s, the town had grown rapidly due to silver mining and was home to a mix of miners, businessmen, outlaws, and lawmen. Tensions between rival groups were common, and violence was an ever-present threat. Holliday's skills and reputation made him both an ally and a target. In Tombstone, his relationship with Wyatt Earp and the Earp family positioned him at the center of local conflicts. These connections, combined with his reputation as a deadly gunfighter, would ultimately lead to the infamous confrontation at the Corral on October 26, 1881. While this event has been dramatized and mythologized countless times, the reality is that Holliday's actions that day were consistent with the survival instincts, courage, and lethal skill he had honed over years in the frontier. The confrontation, brief but intense, demonstrated both his precision and fearlessness, solidifying his reputation. It also reflected the culmination of a life shaped by loss, education, disease, and the harsh realities of frontier life. From a young boy who had witnessed death and grief firsthand in Georgia to a cultured dentist and finally a gunfighter in the lawless towns of the West, Doc Holliday's path was extraordinary. He was a man shaped by circumstance, talent, and choice, a figure who could not easily be categorized, yet whose life and legend continue to fascinate and chill audiences over a century later. In every aspect of his rise, from dentistry to deadly confrontations, Holliday embodied the tensions between civilization and chaos, refinement and violence, intellect and survival, creating a legacy that has endured far beyond his brief and tumultuous life. On October 26, 1881, in the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona, John Henry Doc Holliday reached the moment that would secure his place in the history of the American West. Known for his deadly accuracy and fearless reputation, Holliday was present for a confrontation that would become the most famous gunfight in Western lore, the gunfight at the Corral. By this time, Holliday was already a man in poor health, weakened by years of battling tuberculosis, yet his courage and precision in combat were unmatched. The events leading to the gunfight were rooted in tensions between two factions in Tombstone. On one side were the Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, lawmen determined to uphold order in the rapidly growing town. On the other side were the Cowboys, a loosely organized group of ranchers and outlaws, some of whom were involved in theft, smuggling, and other illegal activities. The atmosphere in Tombstone had been tense for months, with small disputes escalating and the potential for violence growing more likely each day. Holliday, a close friend and loyal ally of the Earp family, became directly involved in these conflicts. Though small in stature and physically weakened by tuberculosis, he had gained a reputation as someone who could not be intimidated, and his presence added both skill and psychological weight to the Earp side of the conflict.